Hello, guys. In this session, we will talk about crisis of development and displacement. Again, a very important topic. You will get this for 20 markers. So either a 10 marker, just like a crisis of development, or they will ask you displacement alone in 10 marker. They can combine this two and they can ask you a 20 marker. So what I'll do is I'll cover this broadly. I'll give you all the topics that you need to address in this, all the areas that you need to cover in this particular question. So there's a revision session for paper two. So here I'll be taking up this topic, crisis of development and displacement. Okay, the PDF of this you can download free of cost, which the details I've given in the description. So if you look at this, we need to give an introduction, of course. And guys, if it is a 20 marker, whatever I am going to give you, you need to write it in a balanced form. Try to incorporate as much as possible. Okay, I'm trying to give you as much as possible. So you can update your notes also if you are missing anything from this, the perspectives or the thinkers or the examples or, the issues that I'm talking about. Okay, so if you look at the introduction, how can we give an introduction? I'll give you a formal introduction, I'll give you a formal conclusion, but in between what I do is I'll guide you what all things you need to write. So in introduction, you will be talking about, overview of this 20th century as a period of development and destruction. So we'll talk about that. I'll give you that. And then you talk about the key issues associated with development in India, because we are addressing this topic from paper two. So we will be focusing mostly on, development in India. And then we will be talking about sociological framing of development crisis. Okay. And then we move to exactly what are the issues associated with it, like displacement, then the environmental problems and sustainability. We talk about poverty, deprivation, and inequalities, how it is connected. We talk about violence against women, right? In fact, all the topics which is there in your syllabus will be trying to adding to this as crisis of development, whether it is violence against women, whether it is caste conflict, whether it is ethnic conflict, communalism, religious revivalism, illiteracy and educational disparity. Everything we will be connecting it with this. Okay. And then we will talk about, definition and characteristics of displacement. We can talk about the types of displacement, like based on development, based on disaster, political displacement, and everything. And we will also talk about the stages of development, which is stages of not development displacement, which is in fact induced by this development. So that's what again crisis of development. So we will talk about Aripa Rampil. Okay, M. Aripa Rampil here. So regarding land alienation, industrialization, and urbanization. So that stages of development induced displacement. And we can talk about the consequences. When we discuss the consequences, we can talk about social and cultural consequence, and we can bring in Durkheim's concept of anomy here, and then economic consequences. There we can bring in Marx alienation concept here, and then psychological consequences, where we can bring, Goffman's identity framework, and gendered impact. Of course, we will be talking about Sylvia Valby on intersectionality. So intersectionality, when I use the word itself, now when I talk about caste, I talk about caste and women, right? When I talk about anything else, right? Aged. So I talk about intersectionality of caste, women, aged. So here, when I talk about crisis of development, then again I'm going to connect this intersectionality. Okay, now we talk about the resistance and protest movement also. Like you can bring in Narmada Bachao Andolan, Niyamagiri movement, and various people reaction from resistance to organized movements we can discuss in this case. Something which you have discussed in environmental movement or the social movements you can bring in here. And legal and constitutional framework like Article 19(1) subclause C, Article 21 right to life, and then Forest Rights Act, and then Panchayat extension to scheduled areas, PESA Act you can talk about. Then we will see how to address the development-induced displacement, like what are the challenges in rehabilitation, like inadequate rehabilitation, lack of community involvement, emotional and psychological neglect, right? So when you talk about rehabilitation, it's not only economic rehabilitation. We need social rehabilitation, like we need physical rehabilitation, we need cultural rehabilitation, right? So that's what I mean by community involvement, emotional, psychological neglect, and everything. Then you propose a solution like comprehensive rehabilitation. What these dimensions you bring in: legal reforms, which is required, community participation, which is required, social support mechanisms, right? And apart from that, we can discuss on various sociological perspectives that again I will give you on development and displacement, like Pati on neo-colonialism and development we can bring in. Amartya Sen's capability approach. We discuss this. See, why I'm talking about the same concepts is because you can apply the same. Once you know the concept, you can apply this across topics in your paper too. So if you see Pati, I have used before neocolonialism and development. Amartya Sen capability approach I've discussed even in case of women, even in case of that many areas I'm using. Jean Rees on cash-centric compensation policies. Hansen and Oliver Smith on displacement dynamics. This is very specific one. And then Abhijit Mukherjee on land for land compensation. Right? Abhijit Banerjee. Then when you conclude, you'll be talking about the paradox of development, right? So on one side, what is expected, on one side, what is happening, what is advantage, what is disadvantage, what is development, and what is actually happening, right? And then inclusive and sustainable approaches we can discuss, because we are going to conclude Ashish Nandi's view on respecting cultural identities, right? Then we talk about vision for development as a tool for societal betterment. So this is how you will be concluding. And guys, if it is a 20 marker, what I want you to do is you need to write everything in a balanced format, because you are talking about the thinkers, you're talking about the perspectives, you're talking about the problems, you're talking about the solutions. So it's a comprehensive, well thought, well-rounded answer. If it's a 10 marker based on question, the demand, like if it is crisis of development, talk about that. If it is displacement, talk about that, right? So that's enough. Now let's start the session. So how to give the introduction. Now guys, before we start, in case if you're looking for any mentorship program or test series or courses, check out the details in the description. Okay, you can get in touch with us for that. Now coming to introduction, you can talk about the 20th century. In fact, witnessed monumental advancements in science and technology and rapid economic growth. And that's what you consider as development. So you briefly mentioned, because question is about crisis of development and displacement. So briefly, you need to mention about development and which context. When we talk about paper one and emergence of sociology, we are talking about that period of modernity. In Indian context, when we discuss in the context of 20th century. So development, right? But this development came with significant social cost. What are they? Like displacement. Briefly talk about the displacement, environmental degradation, and growing inequalities. So now you can bring in Pati's arguments also. Development, you can say, as Pati argue, in fact, often function as a neo-colonial tool that alienate the marginalized communities and support the privileged elites, right? Or privileging the elites. So on one side, you are marginalizing the downtrodden or the lower level communities, or you alienate one section, but you privilege the other section. And this is what exactly you can give us introduction. So you will have to talk about, the multifaceted crisis which is associated with development and displacement. Okay, so development will lead to displacement, if not all, some sections. For example, when we talk about a dam, so that is for development, but some tribal sections are displaced. Now, where they are rehabilitated, what are the issues over there? What are the social issues over there? All these we need to bring in, right? So that too, in a sociological understanding, sociological lens, you need to see when you're writing an answer. This is the same question, which look like a GS question also, but you cannot address in that way. When you are addressing this question, it should be done in a different way. Like when Durkheim addressed religion, he have seen it in a different way, right? Durkheim addressed division of labor. Till then, it was a concept related to economy, improving productivity and thereby profitability and everything. But when Durkheim addressed division of labor, it became sociological, and we understood in terms of its integrative aspect of society. So that way, what you need to bring in is you need to see this from a sociological lens with a sociological perspective, bringing in sociological thinkers and their understanding and use those empirical evidences. So let's start, right? So crisis of development. So there are, of course, this is development, so it is beneficial in many ways, but create a set of interrelated issues or crises that the offshoot of development. First and most important is displacement. So forceful migration, which is caused by large-scale projects like dams, industrial zones, and urban expansion. So here, I can give you, check out the PDF. Complete detail is there. I'll just briefly mention here. Michael Cerena's impoverishment risk and reconstruction model. Talk about that if possible. If you cannot remember, leave it. If you already have prepared and studied, talk about that. So there it is outlined the risk of what are the risks associated with it. Landlessness, joblessness, homelessness, marginalization, food insecurity, increased morbidity, and social, disarticulation faced by displaced communities. Why I told you to add this is because this looks beautiful and this is very good and it covers so much of dimensions. Michael Cernea. In case if it is not there in your notes, add this And if you can remember, it is good one because so much of things I've discussed, right? So Michael Cerena's impoverishment risk and reconstruction model. Just note it down. If possible, when you write displacement, write about Michael Cerena's impoverishment risk and reconstruction model outlines risk like landlessness, joblessness, homelessness, marginalization, food insecurity, increased morbidity, and social disarticulation faced by displaced communities. It's directly connected with displacement. Perfect. And then you can talk about environmental problems and sustainability. So here, of course, whenever anything connected with environmental problem, you talk about Gadgil and Guha. You can talk about Ulrich Beck also. So Gadgil and Guha describe development as form of ecological imperialism and emphasizing how industrial growth exploit natural resources that lead to environmental degradation. And then Ulrich Beck says, in risk society highlights the unintended consequences of technological advancements, including the environmental disasters. Coming to poverty and inequality. See, development often exacerbates class and caste inequalities, right? So Amartya Sen's capability approach argue that true development must enhance individuals' capabilities, not just economic outputs. Then violence against women. We are talking about the issues, right? So violence against women, we can bring in everything which you study in your paper too. All these are offshoots of development only. So on one side, development is there. There will be problems for the caste. There will be problem for the tribes. So ethnic conflict, caste. So caste conflict, women. So violence against women, right? All these are connected. Religious, or communalism, and all these regionalism, because development in one region will lead to regionalism, right? So violence against women. Again, displacement increases vulnerabilities of women, and that will expose them to exploitation and violence. So Sylvia Valby's intersectionality framework can explain how gender, caste, economic status intersect to compound these issues. Okay, so see, this intersectionality concept you can use when you talk about issues of backward caste, especially backward caste and women. When you talk about elderly women, elderly backward caste women. Now, economically downtrodden, backward caste, elderly women, right? So much of connections, intersectionality you can make. And guys, these are perspectives. This is how you need to bring in, right? Bring in the differences in your paper. Bring in that, the analysis that you are making in the paper. Then you talk about caste and ethnic conflicts. There is nothing much to discuss. In fact, you can say development-induced displacement often target the tribals and the lower caste communities. So Andre Bethea examined the intersection of caste and class in rural areas, that's showing how land acquisition for development worsen caste-based inequalities that lead to caste conflicts. Communalism and religious revivalism. Economic insecurity due to displacement, in fact, often fuel the identity-based conflicts. So you can talk about Ashish Nandi, who argues that modernization and displacement erode the traditional identities, and that is leading to communalism as a response to cultural alienation. Okay, and then talk about illiteracy and educational disparities. So here you talk about uneven access to education among the displaced population that perpetuates cycles of poverty. Perry Bourdieu concept of cultural capital. Perry Bourdieu concept of cultural capital you can talk about. That explains how marginalized groups are deprived of educational resources, impacting the social mobility. We discussed this in your paper one also in the chapter on social stratification when we discussed about mobility. Perry Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital. There is a concept of social capital also I discussed, along with that cultural capital also I discussed. Now let's move on to displacement. So this is specific, right? So displacement is a critical issue which is directly linked with development that involves forceful migration of communities. I'm not talking about voluntary migration. Here I'm talking about forceful migration, involuntary migration. See, displacement can be of two types. It's like a kind of migration only. So voluntary will be migration. So here it is forceful migration. And displacement is often permanent and will disrupt the social fabric also. Right. So here you talk about the sociological perspective. Pati, he, according to this, displacement destroys the holistic relationship between nature and culture, especially for indigenous communities. And then Jean Rees criticizes, cash-centric compensation policies that fail to address the long-term well-being of displaced communities. And then Michael Cernea identifies the risk associated with displacement, emphasizing the need for comprehensive rehabilitation frameworks. And you talk about types of displacement, like political displacement caused by wars and political conflicts. developmental displacement that is resulting from infrastructural projects like dams, industries, and other things. Disaster-induced displacement, which is triggered by natural calamities like floods and earthquakes. And then talk about stages of displacement. Here, you can talk about Rampil, land alienation, that the communities lose access to ancestral land. Industrialization, the establishment of industries in rural or tribal areas we discuss. Urbanization, that the expansion of urban areas and encroach upon the rural settlements, so that again lead to displacement. Okay, now the consequences. We'll talk about social and cultural consequences, and we can bring in Emile Durkheim, Hansen, and Oliver Smith. Emile Durkheim's concept of anomy. Right, displacement lead to a breakdown of traditional norms and values that will create a sense of normlessness because of displacement. Hansen and Oliver Smith, if you see, displacement disrupt the social networks and community cohesion that will lead to isolation. Right, and then economic consequences. Here you talk about loss of traditional livelihood and economic insecurity. So Karl Marx alienation theory applies here, as displaced individuals are separated from their means of production. Right, and then psychological consequences. Here you talk about feelings of helplessness, depression, and loss of identity. You talk about Erving Goffman, displacement impacts the individual's, presentation of self in a new environment, and that will cause the identity crisis. So that's a psychological consequence. You talk about Erving Goffman, identity crisis, the presentation of self. That's the that's how it get impact. And then the gendered impact. Here, of course, we'll be talking about Sylvia Valby highlights the intersection of gender and economic displacement. So there's intersectionality you can discuss in many areas. So here, economic displacement and gender. Otherwise, caste and gender. Elderly women and the situation gender. Elderly situation and gender. So women face heightened risk, right? Because especially if you see including exploitation and restricted access to resources. Then you talk about various social movements regarding this, especially environmental movements, resistance to this displacement. In fact, you can see there are a lot of organized movement. Narmada Bachao Andolan, you can talk about, right? Protest against the large dams on the Narmada River. Arundhati Roy, in fact, describes it as a movement to protect livelihoods and ecological integrity. So we discussed these in detail in the environmental movement. So there is no point in getting into that. I just need to guide you. This is what you need to write, right? So that's exactly what I'm doing here. Then Niyamagiri movement, that's a tribal opposition to bauxite mining in Odisha. And then Supreme Court ruling invoked the Forest Right Act and PESA to uphold the tribal rights. Legal and constitutional frameworks. So the Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause C, in fact, is the right to reside and settle anywhere. Article 21, right to life, encompassing the right to livelihood also. And then PESA Act empowers the tribal communities. Now, how to address the challenges of development-induced displacement? What are the challenges? Firstly, inadequate rehabilitation, then lack of community involvement, then emotional and psychological neglect, right? So inadequate rehabilitation, you talk about Jean Rees, in fact, highlights that rehabilitation policies often focus on compensation without addressing the long-term impact. Then community involvement. Decisions are made without consulting the affected communities. Emotional and psychological neglect, if you see the emotional trauma, which is rarely considered in rehabilitation programs. You only focus on economic settlement, compensation, and other things. Beyond that, you have social aspect, you have emotional aspect, you have cultural aspect. So when you talk about settlement, it's not only economic settlement or compensation, it's about social settlement, it's about emotional settlement, it's about cultural settlement, right? So what are the solutions? So here we can discuss about comprehensive rehabilitation, right? As I discussed above. And then you can say land for land compensation and community-centered rehabilitation. So you need to try, if possible, as much as community-centered rehabilitation is what we need to look for. Trying to create a similar environment. Amartya Sen is talking about focusing on enhancing the capabilities of displaced individuals. And then legal reforms like strengthening the Land Reforms Act and ensure its proper implementation. And then community participation, engage the displaced communities in planning and decision-making process. You're not giving any chance or voice to them is again a bigger issue. Then social support mechanisms like provide mental health services, counseling for displaced individuals. Okay, so these are the areas that we need to cover in your answer. Now, how can you conclude this? See, the paradox of development that lies in its ability to uplift and displace simultaneously. On one side, development, on the other side, displacement. On one side, upliftment, on the other side, displacement. So we discussed about sociologists like Pati, Amartya Sen. They emphasize the need for inclusive and sustainable development that address the needs of marginalized communities. So displacement, of course, is inevitable in some cases. When development is coming, for example, dam, displacement is inevitable in that case, but it have to be managed through participatory approaches, equitable compensation, and robust rehabilitation framework. You see, we discussed already Ashish Nandi, as he says, development must respect the cultural and social identity. So when you are writing a sociological answer, this is what we need to focus on. So it should respect cultural and social identities, ensuring that the progress, yes, which is required, development which is required, it does not come at the cost of human dignity and ecological balance. So only then we can say development truly serve as a tool for societal betterment. Right? So development should uplift the vulnerable, not displace them. Right? So this is how you will be concluding your answer. So guys, that's about the session. It was not to take the, discussion like the way we do in the class. It's only for a revision session. So those who have already completed the topic, you might have got a very good revision of the topic. So I think I have done justice to the time you have spent. If you like the video, consider sharing it with your friends also. And in case if you're looking for any mentorship or test series, get in touch with us. So what all things we covered, I told you how to write the introduction, right? And then we discussed about overview of 20th century as a period of development and destruction. And then we discussed the key issues associated with development in India. And then we discussed the crisis of development in terms of displacement, environmental problems and sustainability, poverty, deprivation, inequalities, violence against women, caste conflicts, ethnic conflicts, communalism, religious revivalism, illiteracy and educational disparities. If you don't remember this, I hope you remember definitely the syllabus, right? Take the points from the syllabus and fill this and explain that. That's what the crisis of development is all about. And then we discussed about displacement characteristics, the types and types of displacement, political, developmental disasters. And we discussed Aripa Rampil's development-induced displacement concept, land alienation, industrialization, urbanization. Consequences we discussed, right? Social and cultural, economic, psychological, and the gendered impact. And here we discussed about the Keene concept of anomy, Marx alienation concept, Goffman identity crisis concept, Sylvia Valby's intersectionality. So why I repeat this is because I want you to remember this. For example, I'm sure if you have attended a couple of sessions of mine, you'd never forget, even if you're not my student, you never forget Sylvia Valby that I discussed about intersectionality. Right? So that's how there are certain things where it will get repeated, which you can write everywhere. Again, resistance and protest movement, Narmada Bachao Andolan, Niyamagiri movement, and various other movements you can mention. Legal and constitutional framework we discussed, and how to address the challenges. What are the challenges of rehabilitation? What are the proposed solutions, right? Like comprehensive rehabilitation, legal reforms, community participation, social support mechanisms. And we discussed, most importantly, sociological perspective, Pati on neo-colonialism and development, Amartya Sen's capability approach, which we use in many places, Jean Rees on caste-centric compensation policies, Hansen and Oliver Smith on displacement dynamics, Abhijit Mukherjee on land for land compensation. And then we concluded by talking about paradox of development. We recommended about inclusive and sustainable approaches, Ashish Nandi's views on respecting cultural identities, and that's how we discussed this. So guys, that's about the session. Thank you for attending. So see you in the next video.